Morning. I know a lot of you folks are looking and saying, who is that person up there? My name is Juan Carlos Morales, and that's the same way for everyone. And if you're more comfortable, a lot of folks call me JC. So, but I'm the assistant dean at the Hispanic Ministries program. I'm also a graduate of Gordon-Conwell Seminary from a class of 2001 when David Curry was helping us in Cume, helping out with church history and a lot of other good folks. It's good to be back home, but I'm here to introduce our speaker for the day, Reverend Dr. Gabriel Salguero, and it's my honor and privilege, more than anything else, because he's a friend, amen, and a brother in Christ, but we know each other a little over 10 years at this point. No, about 15 years at this point. And he's one of the folks that the Lord used to really encourage me to begin doctoral studies and to pursue that, the beauty of theology. And I think when you hear him preach, you're going to hear the beauty of theology and how we incorporate it to our sermons and just be a blessing for our churches. But he's next week, he celebrates along with his wife, Jeanette, 10 years as pastors at the Lamb's Church of the Nazarene in New York City and New York. And so he's been a pastor there. Also recently, just in the past month, he was appointed to the New York City Mayor's Clergy Advisory Council, which is a group of pastors that advise the mayor, on diverse issues, primarily dealing with education, dealing with poverty, dealing with immigration in New York City. And just Friday, he was appointed by President Obama as part of the President's Advisory Council, faith-based and neighborhood partnerships. So he's also the president and founder of NALEC, National Latino Evangelical Coalition, which is a national network of evangelical pastors and ministries and organizations addressing issues particularly of immigration, of poverty, of education. And so I want to welcome Pastor Gabriel at this moment and thank him for being here with us. He was hanging out with the Pope last week. So I don't know about your theology. You may see the glow or something. Amen? Anyway, God bless.
No pressure. Let me thank Gordon Theological Seminary, Gordon-Conwell Theological Seminary, my dear friend JC. The older we get, the time runs faster. It's been 17 years since I've known JC and his wife, Mari, and their children came much later. Dr. Gordon Isaac, president, and in our tradition we say, and the first lady of the church of this seminary. I bring you greetings on behalf of my beautiful wife, Jeanette, who's the co-lead pastor of the Lamb's Church of the Nazarene in New York for the last 10 years. It'll be in 2 weeks, 10 years. We're not just married, we're happily married for 14 years, 3 months and 29 days, and 1 hour and 22 minutes. And we have two wonderful boys, John Gabriel and Seth, who are our pride and joy. And also on behalf of the National Latino Evangelical Coalition, I want to celebrate Daniel and his testimony. NALEC has a testimony. We have a memorandum of understanding with Gordon-Conwell Theological Seminary that any one of our churches who enlist pastors or members in their Hispanic Ministries program, thanks to Dr. Padilla and Professor Morales, we have a fellowship, a scholarship, and I want to thank you, all of you, for looking into the future and saying yes to what God is doing, the zeitgeist is doing through Latino growth in Christianity in America and growth of Christianity in the global South. As Philip Jenkins said in The Next Christendom, it is profoundly people of color where Christianity is growing. And on behalf of NALEC and our board, on which JC sits, thank you for this opportunity. I was invited to preach at Gordon-Conwell. I think a sermon is 15 to 20 minutes. That's an opening to a prayer in a Pentecostal church. We're just getting through the names of Jehovah. Lily of the Valleys, Rose of Sharon. Does anybody know that tradition? I want to read from 1 Chronicles, the 12th chapter, the 32nd verse. It may seem disconnected to why I'm here. I want to thank the Hispanic students and their association for inviting me during Hispanic Heritage Month. It's that funny month in America, Hispanic Heritage Month, from September 15th to October 15th. The month of September is Hispanic Heritage Month, in case you were wondering. It's from September 15th to October 15th. The reason, if you want to know, and this is free, after this I will charge per credit. The reason it's during that month is because during that month, at least 7 nations in Latin America declared their independence. And that's why it's Hispanic Heritage Month. At the end of that month, there's a little celebration that in America is called Columbus Day on October 12th. But in Puerto Rico, it's called Día de la Resistencia Indígena, Day of Indigenous Resistance. It just shows to show you that people see history in different ways.
That's right. That's right.
Life is complex. Christian history is complex. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, in his letter After 10 Years, in that second part of the letter, he's taking inventory of what he learned from the Teutonic shift in Nazi Germany. Dietrich Bonhoeffer has this phrase that I quoted this week in next month's article to Christianity Today in a response to Michael Gerson and Peter Werner about changing shifts in America and the changing position of evangelicalism in America. I recommend Michael and Peter's article. I less recommend my article, but it's there too. Bonhoeffer says in After 10 Years, and I'm paraphrasing, not quoting, we must learn to see history from the view from below. The view from below. It's interesting that a Christian is saying that he must learn from the view from below, when much of early Christian history, much of the Gospels, much of the early and the primitive church is from below. All of you who are church historians, and I am not one, so pardon the abbreviated version. You can get the in-depth version from your historians. Before Constantinian Christianity, it is from below. It's a grassroots movement. Es de la tierra. Cristianismo es de la tierra. It rises from the earth. It is profoundly organic. It is profoundly grassroots. Pardon my Pentecostal bent. It is profoundly pneumatological. Jesus said about the Spirit in the 3rd chapter of John from the King James Version, the wind blow where it listeth. In English, the Spirit does whatever the Spirit wants to do. And unless you're born of the water and of the Spirit, you can't understand these things of the Spirit. They cannot be comprehended. And as you know, Dietrich Bonhoeffer is the son of a PhD in psychology. It is often said that many of the great thinkers of his time, he was not just a PhD in psychology, he was the chair of the department in Germany. There would be conversations about Jung and Freud, and Dietrich Bonhoeffer would grow up around that. And so when this Nazification of Germany begins to take hold, and his grandmother, Dietrich Bonhoeffer's grandmother, one of the first to break the line when Nazi Germany said it is illegal to shop from German Jews, his grandmother crossed the line and shopped at a Jewish shop. And they asked her why. She says, because I'm a Christian. Dietrich Bonhoeffer had 2 PhDs by the time he was 38. He had time on his hands. And he said, we must learn to view history from below. Mariano Anzuela, the great Mexican writer, calls it los de abajo, from below. And recently, much of evangelicalism in America had a Chicken Little moment. Are you familiar with the Chicken Little moment? The sky is falling. The sky is falling. In light of the Supreme Court decision in Obergefell, many of us, our cosmology, our understanding of evangelicals' role in public policy, in culture, read Andy Crouch, read James Davidson Hunter, read all of these bright minds on the issues of cultural making and social transformation. That, and Michael Gerson in his thesis begins to say, we are no longer at the center. And my response to them is, when was I ever at the center? I'm a brown evangelical. I'm a person whose father has a PhD in suffering, learned to read in prison, had a radical conversion experience, graduated from Teen Challenge, raised his 3 sons and daughter and put them through college, working during the day and pastoring at night. Like most American evangelicals who are now learning to be bivocational, Latino evangelicals have been bivocational for the long history of evangelicalism in America. And so for many of us, we're having the Bonhoeffer moment. And the rest of us are watching closely and saying, ¿Qué hay de nuevo? What's so new about this? Evangelicalism has never been and will never be a monolith. The beauty of the Pentecost moment is that we're so diverse. Unity never means uniformity. And in 1 Chronicles chapter 12, you have a pericope about a changing moment. Say with me, a changing moment. Say it again in Español. Un momento cambiante. A changing moment. What is happening? There's a transition in power. Saul is being dethroned and David is ascending. The ascension of David. In those verses, beginning from verse 23 onward, it talks about who unites to David in the transition from Saul to David there at Hebron. And it begins to list people. You know, the Bible is good at this begets thing. It must have been written by a Latino. If you allow me hermeneutical license. And it begins to list tribes. And in the middle of this, you have this phrase in the 32nd verse, and from the tribe of Issachar. And then it just doesn't just run over them and tell you how many it does. It gives you a particular characteristic of the men of Issachar that I think might be helpful for this moment in U.S. evangelicalism. They were men. And since we live in late modernity, I will say men and women who understood the times and knew what Israel should do. If you will allow me for the next 7 minutes of my prayer, because it's not a sermon unless it's 35 minutes or more. To talk about leadership during changing times. And you might ask, why during Hispanic Heritage Month will I speak about leadership during changing times? It's because many of us are suffering from apocalyptic visions and we're watching too many YouTubes about blood moons. Chicken Little moments that somehow Supreme Court decisions changes the sovereignty of God, the power of the church, the witness of holy women, men, and children. Somehow that this decision in 2015 is radically different than Roe v. Wade in 1973. Question: how come much of evangelicalism in America didn't fall apart when they gutted the civil rights law 2 years ago? Why wasn't that our Chicken Little moment? Or when after 10 years of fighting for immigration reform, and we have a whole list of scriptural imperatives around xenophilia, translated into English as hospitality. Remember hospitality, says the writer of the book of Hebrews. For many of you have entertained angels unaware. Or Jesus in Matthew 25, in the judgment of the ethne, translated in the King James Version as the judgment of the nations. ironically, says, here's the caveat. For I was hungry, you fed me. Naked, you covered me. In prison, I was a convict and you visited me. I was a stranger and you welcomed me. And the nations, the ethne, will ask, when did we see you as this? How come that wasn't a moment where we felt dislodged from power in policy and culture? It seems to me evangelicals have sex on their mind an awful lot. We should. I am not making light of this critical moment in the redefining of biblical marriage. I am not dismissing it. I am not saying we should not raise our voices. What I am saying is that we have to discover how to view things from below. That our change in position might require an Issachar moment. That leadership in times of transition, when we are no longer the dominant voting bloc, when we are no longer the loudest voices, when we are no longer determining the elections or cultures of the future, what is aesthetically beautiful and noble in culture, what media defines as acceptable, what music determines the values and the cantus firmus of the next generation. If that moment has happened, ¿qué vas a hacer? What will you do? I submit to you, it's not a new moment. Not for me. Not for many of your sisters and brothers in black and brown evangelicalism and Christianity. Not for many of your sisters and brothers in global evangelicalism in Asia and Africa and indigenous peoples and aborigines in Australia. It is not a new moment. So maybe we can learn something from Dr. King. That somehow we still have the power of the pulpit, moral persuasion, and biblical ethics. That the Issachar moment requires several things. Number one is don't panic. God is still sovereign. God still sits on God's throne. Christ still died, was buried, resurrected, and sits at the right hand of the Father, always interceding for us. Don't panic. Number two, have conviction but civility. How often have we had conviction with lack of civility? It is as if we learn nothing from Christ. The other day I was at the White House and I posted that I was going to meet the Pope. You know, he's Argentinian. The Argentines are taking over. They have Luis Palau, the Pope, and Messi. Some of you are like, who's Messi? Only the world's greatest soccer player. And people put on, how dare you? So, you know, and then I was like, get a grip, brother. I dare because when you have a strong conviction, you can sit next to anybody without being easily shaken. I said, how dare Daniel advise Nebuchadnezzar? How dare Joseph be the chief lieutenant of Pharaoh? How dare Esther sit and sleep with Artaxerxes? It's as if we don't understand how to engage civilly, but with conviction. The margins are never a place to be feared. It is there where the church has grown historically. The blood of the martyrs has been the seedbed and the growing for the church. Or is it that we have such a deep love affair for power and influence that the Gospels have no significance for this moment? Juventud, divino tesoro, que te vas para no volver. Cuando quiero llorar, no lloro. A veces lloro sin querer. Plural ha sido la celeste canción de mi primavera. Rubén Darío, the famous poet of Latin America, the name of that poem is Canción de Otoño en Primavera. It is called Autumn Song in Springtime. He is weeping the loss of a moment. But the loss of a moment is just the genesis of another moment. is where we can learn, as the African-American church teaches us, to lean on the everlasting arms, instead of in our own power and influence. And let me be clear, power and influence have its place, and it is not a wrong place of engagement vis-a-vis William Wilberforce. It is a legitimate form of engagement. But if we trust in our own weapons, we have not understood the times nor how we ought to live. And so, sisters and brothers, at this prestigious, historical citadel of evangelical intelligentsia in the Northeast, I celebrate what you have done. I applaud what you are doing. And I simultaneously ask, what are you going to do now that power has shifted? Fear not is repeated over 360 times in the Bible. Some say 365, one for every day of the year. God must know our propensity for fear. First, don't fear. Secondly, have convicted civility. And thirdly, be winsome without capitulating. Do not go gentle into that dark night. Rage against the dying of the light. I'm concerned that much of our models of evangelical engagement in culture, in ethics, in medicine, in religion, in politics, in race, have nothing to do with the gospel of Jesus Christ. Have nothing to do with a grassroots movement that from its very initiation was a radical integration of diversity under the broad unity of the cross. I'm concerned that when this transition comes from Saul to David, we don't have enough tribes of Issachar. But I am also hope-filled that places like this and churches all over America, white, black, multi-ethnic, have understood that this moment is not our maze runner, is not a dystopic vision of the end of the world. We are not always living in a 1984 George Orwellian novel where Big Brother is watching. Not afraid of Big Brother. I have a great Father. And so, my grandmother used to sing, firmes y adelantes, huéspedes de la fe, sin temor alguno, que Jesús nos ve. Onward, Christian soldiers, marching as to war, with the cross of Jesus going on before.